I never thought a Tuesday afternoon in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, would end with my wife nearly being murdered over a parking space. But that is exactly what happened when our HOA president decided that enforcement of neighborhood rules was worth committing attempted murder. My name is Marcus Chen, and my wife Elena and I had moved into the Saguaro Heights community just 8 months earlier. We were both in our early 30s, excited about finally owning our first real home after years of renting cramped apartments downtown. The development was one of those cookie-cutter neighborhoods that had sprung up during the housing boom, with identical stucco houses painted in varying shades of beige and tan, red tile roofs, and landscaping that consisted mostly of decorative rocks and the occasional desert willow tree. The HOA fees were steep at $250 a month, but we figured it was worth it for the maintained common areas and the community pool. What we did not anticipate was dealing with Brenda Hutchison, the HOA president who treated the neighborhood covenants like they were handed down from Mount Sinai. Brenda was 53 years old, had short blonde hair that she kept in a severe bob cut, and wore too much foundation that settled into the lines around her mouth. She drove a white Lexus SUV and seemed to have nothing better to do than patrol the neighborhood looking for violations. In our first month living there, we had already received 3 notices. The first was because Elena had left our trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup day. The second was for having a small decorative garden gnome in our front yard, which apparently violated the covenant's ban on lawn ornaments. The third was for parking our second car in the driveway instead of the garage. That third violation was what started the entire mess. You see, we had 2 vehicles, my Honda Accord and Elena's Toyota RAV4. Our garage was a standard 2-car setup, but we had been using half of it as a home gym since the pandemic had made us both more conscious about staying healthy. We had a weight rack, a treadmill, and some yoga mats set up in there. That meant 1 car had to stay in the driveway. According to Section 7.3 of the Saguaro Heights Community Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, driveways were meant for temporary parking only, and vehicles should be garaged when possible. Brenda had interpreted this to mean that any car parked in a driveway for more than a few hours was a violation. I had tried to be reasonable. I called Brenda after receiving that third notice and explained our situation. The conversation went nowhere. She insisted that we needed to keep both vehicles in the garage as the covenants intended. When I pointed out that the covenant did not actually specify a time limit and used the word possible, implying some flexibility, she cut me off. Mr. Chen, the covenants exist to maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics. When we allow people to start making their own interpretations, it creates a slippery slope. Next thing you know, people will have boats and RVs parked in their driveways, and this community will look like a trailer park. I tried not to lose my temper. Brenda, it's just 1 car. It's a normal Toyota SUV, not a monster truck. It's clean, well-maintained, and it's parked neatly in our own driveway. I don't see how this affects property values. The rules are the rules, she said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone that made my teeth clench. If you wanted to make your own rules, you should not have bought in an HOA community. I hung up feeling frustrated but not overly concerned. It was just a parking issue. How bad could it get? Over the next few months, the situation escalated in ways I could not have predicted. Brenda began leaving notes on Elena's car whenever it was parked in the driveway. The notes started out as formal reminders about the covenant violation but gradually became more aggressive. One said, "This is your final warning. Compliance is not optional." Another read, "Your continued disregard for community standards is noted and will have consequences." Elena was a pediatric nurse who worked 12-hour shifts at Phoenix Children's Hospital. She would come home exhausted, and the last thing she needed was to find hostile notes tucked under her windshield wiper. I called Brenda again and asked her to stop with the notes, pointing out that we were already aware of her position and the passive-aggressive messages were harassment. "I'm documenting your violations," Brenda said coldly. "And I would be very careful about throwing around words like harassment, Mr. Chen. I'm performing my duties as HOA president, which the community elected me to do." "Did they elect you to bully your neighbors?" I shot back. She hung up on me. Things got worse. Brenda began attending every HOA board meeting and making our parking situation a regular agenda item. She pushed for increasing our fines, which started at $50 per violation and eventually reached $200. We were getting fined almost weekly. I started taking photographs time-stamped with my phone, documenting that Elena's car was only in the driveway during her workdays and that I always parked in the garage. We moved the gym equipment to one side and started parking both cars inside whenever possible, but Elena's schedule was unpredictable. Sometimes she had to rush to work for emergency shifts, and she would leave her car in the driveway. Every single time, Brenda would find it and issue a new fine. I consulted with a real estate attorney named David Kowalski, who specialized in HOA disputes. He reviewed our covenants and told me that while Brenda was technically within her rights to enforce the parking rules, her interpretation was overly strict, and the escalating fines could potentially be challenged as excessive. He suggested we request a hearing with the HOA board to dispute the fines and try to reach a reasonable compromise. "The problem with HOAs," David explained during our consultation in his office in downtown Scottsdale, "is that they operate with very little oversight. Board members are usually volunteers who have no legal training, and they can abuse their power if they are not careful. Your best bet is to document everything, stay calm, and try to work within the system. If that fails, you can file a lawsuit, but that gets expensive quickly." I took his advice and requested a formal hearing. The Seguero Heights HOA board consisted of 5 members, Brenda as president, a vice president named Robert Patterson who was a retired accountant, a secretary named Linda Morales, and 2 at-large members, Jeff Thompson and Susan Bradshaw. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the community clubhouse. Elena and I showed up with a folder full of documentation, photographs, copies of the covenants with relevant sections highlighted, and a written statement explaining our position. The clubhouse was a modest building near the community pool, with a small kitchen, a meeting room with folding tables and chairs, and outdated carpet that smelled faintly of mildew. About a dozen other residents were there, either to observe or to address their own issues with the board. Brenda sat at the head table with the other board members, looking smug. She was wearing a navy blue blazer and had reading glasses perched on her nose, which she kept removing to gesture with as she spoke. When our turn came, she did not even pretend to be impartial. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen are here to dispute their accumulated parking fines, which now total $1,400, Brenda announced, shuffling papers in front of her. "They seem to believe that the rules do not apply to them." I stood up, trying to keep my voice level. "That is not accurate. We have been doing our best to comply with the covenants. The issue is that the interpretation being applied here is unreasonably strict. The covenant says vehicles should be garaged when possible. We have 2 cars and a 2-car garage, but we have been using part of that space for exercise equipment. When Elena works her shifts at the hospital, her car is sometimes in the driveway. This is a reasonable use of our property." Robert Patterson, the vice president, leaned forward. He was a heavy-set man in his late 60s with a gray mustache. "Why not just move the equipment out of the garage? That would solve the problem." "We have moved it to the side," Elena said, speaking up for the first time. Her voice was calm but firm. "We park both cars inside when we can." "But my schedule is not predictable. I work in pediatric emergency care and I get called in at odd hours. Sometimes I am rushing out the door and I do not have time to rearrange the garage." "That sounds like a personal problem," Brenda interjected. The covenants do not have an exception clause for inconvenient work schedules. Linda Morales, the secretary, looked uncomfortable. She was a small woman in her 40s with curly brown hair and glasses. "I don't know, Brenda. This seems pretty harsh. They are not parking a junker or an RV. It is just a regular car." "The covenants are clear," Brenda snapped. "We can't just ignore them because someone has an excuse. That sets a precedent." Jeff Thompson, one of the at-large members, rubbed his chin thoughtfully. He was in his mid-50s, tall and thin, with wire-rimmed glasses. "What if we implemented a permit system? If someone has a legitimate reason for driveway parking, they can apply for a temporary permit. That way we are still enforcing standards but allowing for reasonable exceptions." Brenda's face turned red. "Absolutely not. We are not creating loopholes for people to exploit. The rules exist for a reason." The discussion went back and forth for another 20 minutes. Susan Bradshaw, the other at-large member, barely spoke except to agree with whatever Brenda said. In the end, the board voted 3-2 to uphold the fines. Brenda, Susan, and Robert voted against us. Linda and Jeff voted in our favor, but it was not enough. As we left the clubhouse that night, I felt a simmering anger building inside me. Elena squeezed my hand. "We will figure it out," she said quietly. "Maybe we should just pay the fines and move on. It is not worth the stress." But I could not let it go. It was not about the money, though $1,400 was certainly not insignificant. It was about the principle. Brenda was drunk on her tiny bit of power, and she was making our lives miserable for no good reason. Over the next 2 weeks, I tried a different approach. I started attending HOA meetings regularly and speaking during the open comment period. I pointed out other covenant violations that Brenda was ignoring. There were houses with dead landscaping, which violated the requirement to maintain yards. There were people who left their trash cans out for days, not just hours. There was a guy 3 streets over who had been working on a motorcycle in his driveway every weekend, which clearly violated the prohibition on vehicle repair in common view. I was not trying to get these people in trouble. I was trying to demonstrate that Brenda was applying the rules selectively and unfairly. Brenda did not appreciate this. At one meeting, she actually pounded her fist on the table and told me I was wasting everyone's time with frivolous complaints. I responded by filing a formal complaint against her with the board, alleging selective enforcement and abuse of power. Linda and Jeff seemed sympathetic, but Robert and Susan backed Brenda completely. The complaint went nowhere. Then came the Tuesday afternoon that changed everything. It was March 18th, unseasonably warm even for Phoenix. The temperature hit 94 degrees by midday. I was working from home, doing software development for a tech company based in California. Elena had the day off and had spent the morning running errands. She came home around 3 in the afternoon, pulling into our driveway in her RAV4. I was on a video call in my home office and barely noticed her arrive. About 15 minutes later, I heard raised voices outside. At first, I tried to ignore it, focusing on the project management discussion happening on my screen. But the voices got louder, and I recognized Elena's voice, which had an edge of panic to it. I excused myself from the call and rushed to the front door. What I saw when I opened the door made my blood run cold. Brenda Hutchison had Elena pinned against the side of her car, both hands wrapped around my wife's throat. Elena's face was turning red, her hands clawing at Brenda's arms, her eyes wide with terror. Brenda's face was contorted with rage, her teeth bared, spit flying from her mouth as she screamed something I could not make out. I ran toward them, my heart pounding, already pulling out my phone to call 911. But before I could reach them, someone else got there first. A man in jeans and a Phoenix Suns t-shirt came sprinting from the direction of the mailboxes at the end of our cul-de-sac. He was in his early 40s, fit and muscular, with a buzz cut and a serious expression. "Police, let her go now," he shouted in a voice that carried unmistakable authority. Brenda either did not hear him or did not care. She kept squeezing Elena's throat. Elena's struggles were getting weaker. The man grabbed Brenda's wrists and yanked her arms apart with controlled force, breaking her grip on Elena. Elena collapsed to the ground, gasping and coughing, her hands going to her throat. The man twisted Brenda's arms behind her back and forced her face down onto our driveway, kneeling on her back to keep her pinned. "I said I'm police," he repeated, breathing hard from the exertion. "Stop resisting." I dropped to my knees next to Elena, my hands shaking. "Are you okay? Can you breathe?" She nodded, still coughing, tears streaming down her face. There were already visible red marks on her neck where Brenda's fingers had dug in. I could see the outline of individual fingers starting to bruise. Brenda was screaming obscenities from her position on the ground, thrashing under the man's weight. "Get off me! You can't do this! I'm the HOA president. She was parked illegally." The man kept her pinned with one knee while pulling out his phone with his free hand. "This is Detective Ryan Holloway, badge number 4782, off-duty. I need units at 14,247 West Desert Willow Drive in the Saguaro Heights subdivision. I have a suspect in custody for assault and battery, possible attempted strangulation. Victim is on scene and needs medical evaluation. Suspect is resisting." He rattled off the information calmly, like this was just another day at work for him. I realized that we had gotten incredibly lucky. This man, Detective Holloway, lived somewhere in our neighborhood. I had seen him around but never spoken to him. He had been checking his mail when he heard the commotion and responded immediately. Within 5 minutes, the 1st Phoenix Police Department patrol unit arrived, lights flashing but no siren. 2 officers got out, both young and alert. Detective Holloway quickly explained the situation while maintaining control of Brenda, who had finally stopped struggling and was now crying and muttering about how this was all a misunderstanding. One officer took over custody of Brenda, cuffing her hands behind her back and reading her Miranda rights in a clear, professional tone. The other officer, a woman with her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, came over to check on Elena and me. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Sarah Gonzalez." "Can you tell me what happened?" Elena's voice was hoarse and shaky, but she managed to explain. "I came home from running errands and parked in our driveway. I was getting groceries out of the back when Brenda appeared. She started yelling at me about the parking violation, saying she was sick of us ignoring her. I tried to walk away and go inside, but she followed me and kept yelling. When I turned around to tell her to leave me alone, she just lunged at me and grabbed my throat. I could not breathe. I thought she was going to kill me." Officer Gonzalez took notes and photographed the marks on Elena's neck from multiple angles. An ambulance arrived shortly after, and the paramedics insisted on checking Elena's throat and vital signs. They recommended she go to the hospital for a full evaluation, as strangulation could cause internal injuries that were not immediately apparent. Meanwhile, Brenda was placed in the back of a patrol car. She had gone from screaming to crying to a kind of blank shock. I could see her through the window, mascara running down her face, staring at nothing. Detective Holloway came over to speak with us once the immediate chaos had settled. Up close, I could see he had green eyes and a scar on his left cheek. "I'm really sorry you folks had to go through that. I live 2 streets over, just moved here about 4 months ago. I was grabbing my mail when I heard the screaming. Good thing I was home today." "Thank you," I said, and my voice cracked with emotion. "You saved my wife's life. If you had not been there, I do not know what would have happened." He shook his head. "You would have pulled her off, but it's good it got stopped quickly. Strangulation is one of the most dangerous forms of assault. It can cause serious injury or death within minutes, and it is a major red flag for future violence. The fact that this was over a parking dispute makes it even more concerning. This woman has serious issues." Officer Gonzalez came back over. "Mr. Chen, Mrs. Chen, we are going to need detailed statements from both of you. Detective Holloway has already given his witness statement. Mrs. Chen, you should go to the hospital and get checked out. We can take your full statement later today or tomorrow morning, whichever works better." I rode in the ambulance with Elena to Phoenix Children's Hospital where she worked. It was surreal walking into the emergency department where she normally cared for patients and having her be the one on a gurney. Her colleagues were shocked and worried, and one of the attending physicians, Dr. Raymond Park, insisted on personally overseeing her examination. The evaluation took about 2 hours. They did a CT scan of her neck to rule out damage to her trachea or blood vessels, checked her neurological function, and monitored her oxygen levels. Thankfully, the results came back mostly clear. She had significant bruising and some swelling, but no fractures or vascular damage. Dr. Park prescribed pain medication and told her to watch for any difficulty breathing, swallowing, or changes in her voice over the next few days. "You are very lucky," he told her seriously. Strangulation can be fatal, and survivors often have lasting complications. The fact that someone intervened so quickly probably saved you from more serious injury. We got home around 8 that evening. My parents, who lived in Temp, came over to stay with us for a few days. My mother, who had always been protective of Elena, broke down crying when she saw the bruises on her neck. My father, normally calm and stoic, looked like he wanted to drive to wherever Brenda was being held and strangle her himself. The next morning, a detective from the Phoenix Police Department's assault unit called to schedule interviews. Detective Laura Simmons was a 20-year veteran with a calm, professional demeanor. She came to our house with her partner, Detective Mark Stevens, and spent nearly 3 hours getting every detail of our history with Brenda, the HOA dispute, and the events of the previous day. "This is pretty clearly assault and aggravated assault," Detective Simmons explained. In Arizona, strangulation that impedes breathing or blood circulation is automatically elevated to aggravated assault, which is a felony. Given the context and the severity of the attack, the county attorney's office will almost certainly prosecute. You can also pursue a restraining order, which I strongly recommend. We filed for an order of protection that same day. The court granted a temporary order immediately based on the police report and photographs of Elena's injuries. A hearing for a permanent order was scheduled for the following week. Over the next several days, word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Apparently, several residents had witnessed parts of the incident or heard about it from neighbors who had. Opinion was divided. Some people were horrified and supportive, bringing us meals and offering help. Others seemed to think we had somehow provoked Brenda or that the whole thing was being blown out of proportion. A few members of the old guard who were friends with Brenda actually had the audacity to suggest that Elena must have done something to set her off. Linda Morales, the HOA secretary, came to our door 2 days after the attack. She looked exhausted and upset. "Marcus, Elena, I am so incredibly sorry about what happened. This is inexcusable. I have called an emergency board meeting to discuss Brenda's removal as president. Jeff is with me on this. We are going to push for a special election." "What about Robert and Susan?" I asked. Linda's expression darkened. "Robert is saying we need to wait until the legal process plays out before making any decisions. Susan is actually defending Brenda, saying she must have been under a lot of stress. It is absolutely insane." The emergency meeting happened that Saturday. Elena did not feel up to attending, but I went, accompanied by my father and Detective Holloway, who had offered to come along as a show of support and as a witness to what had happened. The clubhouse was packed with residents, many of whom I had never seen at a meeting before. The tension in the room was palpable. Linda called the meeting to order and immediately moved to have Brenda removed from her position as HOA president and from the board entirely. Jeff seconded the motion. What followed was one of the most surreal and frustrating experiences of my life. Robert Patterson stood up, his face red, and launched into a speech about due process and not rushing to judgment. "Brenda has served this community for 8 years. She has kept our property values high and our neighborhood standards intact. We cannot just throw her out based on one incident when we do not know the full story. One incident, I could not help but interrupt, my voice rising. She tried to kill my wife. She strangled her in broad daylight. There were multiple witnesses, including an off-duty police detective. What more do you need to know? Susan Bradshaw, a thin woman in her 60s with gray hair and thin lips, actually had the nerve to say, "Well, your wife did violate the parking covenants repeatedly. Brenda was just trying to enforce the rules." The room erupted. Multiple people started shouting at once. Detective Holloway stood up, and his presence commanded immediate attention. "Ma'am, with all due respect, there is no parking violation on earth that justifies attempted murder. I witnessed Brenda Hutchison strangling Elena Chen." Elena's face was turning purple and she was losing consciousness. If I had not intervened, she could have died. This was not about enforcing rules. This was a violent criminal assault, and Miss Hutchison is in jail right now facing felony charges because of it. Linda seized the moment. "We need to vote. All in favor of removing Brenda Hutchison as HOA president and as a member of the board, say aye." "Aye," Linda and Jeff said loudly. "Opposed?" "Nay," Robert and Susan said, though Susan's voice was quieter, less certain than before. "The vote is tied at 2-2, Linda said. "Under our bylaws, we need a majority to remove a board member. We will have to bring this to a general vote of the membership." The process of organizing a special membership vote took another 2 weeks. In the meantime, the criminal case against Brenda moved forward. She was charged with aggravated assault, a Class 3 felony in Arizona that carried a potential sentence of 5 to 15 years in prison. Her bail was set at $50,000, which she posted through a bail bondsman. As part of her release conditions, she was required to stay away from Elena and me and to wear a GPS ankle monitor. The protective order hearing happened the following Tuesday. Elena and I, along with Detective Holloway, testified about the attack and the history of harassment leading up to it. Brenda's attorney, a slick-looking guy named Martin Reeves, tried to argue that the incident was an isolated outburst caused by extreme stress, and that Brenda posed no ongoing threat. The judge was not buying it. Judge Patricia Winters, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, granted a permanent order of protection for 1 year, requiring Brenda to stay at least 300 feet away from us, our home, and Elena's workplace. She also ordered Brenda to surrender any firearms she owned and to undergo a psychological evaluation. "Miss Hutchison," Judge Winters said sternly, looking over her reading glasses at Brenda, who sat at the defense table looking small and defeated. "I have reviewed the evidence in this case, including the police reports, witness statements, and photographic evidence of the victim's injuries. Your actions were violent, dangerous, and completely unacceptable. You are fortunate that Mrs. Chen survived without permanent injury. I want to be very clear. If you violate this order in any way, you will be arrested immediately and your bail in the criminal case will be revoked. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Brenda said quietly, her voice barely audible. The special HOA membership vote took place in early April. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, but the space was not large enough for all the residents who wanted to attend, so they set up a video feed to the pool area outside. Over 300 homeowners showed up, representing about 70% of the community. It was the largest turnout in Saguaro Heights history. Linda Morales, acting as interim president, presented the motion to remove Brenda Hutchison from the board and to strip her of any authority in the HOA. She explained the situation factually and carefully, sticking to documented events and avoiding inflammatory language. Several residents stood up to speak in favor of the removal, including Detective Holloway, a retired teacher named Margaret Fuller who had also been harassed by Brenda over a mailbox decoration, and a young couple who had been fined repeatedly for having a vegetable garden in their backyard. A few people spoke in Brenda's defense, mostly older residents who valued the strict enforcement of covenants and seemed to genuinely believe that the neighborhood would fall into chaos without her iron fist. But their arguments rang hollow in the face of what had happened. You could enforce rules without assaulting people. When the vote was finally called, it was not even close. 247 residents voted to remove Brenda. Only 38 voted against. 13 abstained. Brenda Hutchison was officially out as HOA president and off the board. Linda was elected as the new president in a follow-up vote, with Jeff Thompson as vice president. One of their first actions was to revise the parking covenant to allow for reasonable driveway use, and to establish a permit system for residents who needed long-term driveway parking for legitimate reasons. The fines against Elena and me were voided entirely. The criminal case took longer to resolve. Brenda's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal for a lesser charge, but the county attorney's office was not interested. The evidence was overwhelming, and strangulation cases were taken very seriously due to the lethality and the correlation with domestic violence and future violent acts. The trial was scheduled for September. Elena and I both had to testify. I was nervous about facing Brenda in court, but Detective Simmons prepared us well. The prosecution, led by Assistant County Attorney Rachel Mendoza, presented a clear and compelling case. They showed the jury photographs of Elena's injuries, played the 911 recording from Detective Holloway, and had multiple witnesses testify, including Detective Holloway himself, me, and 2 neighbors who had seen or heard parts of the attack. Brenda's defense was weak. Her attorney tried to paint her as a dedicated volunteer who had simply snapped under pressure, suggesting that the stress of managing the HOA combined with personal issues had led to a momentary loss of control. He presented testimony from a psychologist who diagnosed Brenda with adjustment disorder and claimed she was not a danger to society. But the prosecution shredded that argument on cross-examination, pointing out that Brenda had shown a pattern of aggressive and escalating behavior toward Elena and me over many months, culminating in a premeditated attack. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Brenda guilty of aggravated assault. At her sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, Judge Thomas Brennan sentenced her to 5 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. He also ordered her to complete anger management and mental health treatment, and to have no contact with Elena or me for 10 years after her release. "Miss Hutchison," Judge Brennan said, his voice grave, "you took a position of responsibility in your community and abused it. You harassed your neighbors over trivial matters, and when they did not comply with your unreasonable demands, you attempted to kill one of them. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a violent assault that could have ended in tragedy. The sentence I am imposing reflects the seriousness of your crime and the need to protect the community from further harm." Brenda stood silently, tears running down her face as the bailiff led her away in handcuffs. Elena and I also filed a civil lawsuit against Brenda for assault, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and medical expenses. Our attorney, David Kowalski, who had helped us with the initial HOA dispute, handled the case. Brenda's homeowner's insurance refused to cover the claim, arguing that intentional criminal acts were not covered under the policy. Without insurance backing her, Brenda had limited resources to fight the lawsuit. Her attorney negotiated a settlement of $125,000, which was close to the maximum we could realistically collect given her financial situation. The settlement included a structured payment plan that would continue even after her release from prison. Life slowly returned to normal, though normal was different now. Elena had nightmares for months after the attack. She started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma, and she took a leave of absence from work to recover both physically and emotionally. The bruises on her neck faded, but she wore scarves and turtlenecks for weeks, self-conscious about the marks and the questions they invited. I struggled with my own feelings of guilt and anger. I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering if I could have done something differently to prevent the attack. I blamed myself for not taking Brenda's escalating harassment more seriously, for not pushing harder to get a restraining order before things turned violent. My therapist helped me work through those feelings, reminding me that I was not responsible for Brenda's choices and actions. The neighborhood changed too. The new HOA board under Linda's leadership took a much more reasonable approach to governance. They focused on actual community improvement rather than nitpicking enforcement of petty rules. The ridiculous fines stopped. People started feeling like they could actually enjoy their homes without fear of constant scrutiny. Ironically, the community became more cohesive and friendly after Brenda's removal. Neighbors who had lived next to each other for years started actually talking and getting to know each other. Detective Holloway and his wife, Jennifer, became good friends of ours. We had them over for dinner several times, and our families celebrated holidays together. Ryan told us that in his 15 years as a police officer, he had worked hundreds of cases, but being in the right place at the right time to save Elena was one of the moments he was most proud of. You hear about off-duty cops stopping crimes, and you always wonder if you will recognize the moment when it comes. He said one evening as we sat on our back patio, watching the Arizona sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. I am just glad I was there. And I am glad I did not hesitate. Elena squeezed his hand. You did more than not hesitate. You saved my life. I will never be able to thank you enough for that. The experience changed how we thought about HOAs and community governance. We became more involved in the association, attending meetings and serving on committees. I joined the Architectural Review Committee, and Elena volunteered to organize community social events. We wanted to help ensure that what happened to us never happened to anyone else in Saguaro Heights. We also connected with other HOA reform advocates and shared our story publicly. I wrote articles for local news outlets and spoke at community forums about the need for accountability and oversight in homeowner associations. Arizona law provided very little protection for homeowners against abusive HOAs, and I became passionate about pushing for legislative reform. I testified before state legislative committees considering bills that would increase transparency requirements for HOAs, limit the fees they could charge, and provide easier paths for homeowners to dispute unfair enforcement actions. One of the most rewarding outcomes of our advocacy was meeting other families who had been victimized by overzealous HOA boards. We formed a support network and shared strategies for fighting back against unreasonable rules and harassment. Some of the stories we heard were heartbreaking: elderly people being foreclosed on over minor violations, families being fined into bankruptcy, people living in constant fear in their own homes. It reinforced that what happened to us, while extreme, was part of a larger pattern of abuse that occurred when people were given power without proper checks and balances. The case attracted media attention beyond Phoenix. National news outlets picked up the story, and it became a cautionary tale about HOA overreach. I did interviews with reporters from newspapers and television stations across the country. The overwhelming response from the public was supportive, with thousands of people sharing their own HOA horror stories. It sparked conversations about whether HOAs, as currently structured, were doing more harm than good. There were detractors, of course. Some people accused us of playing the victim or exaggerating what happened. Online trolls left nasty comments on news articles, suggesting that Elena had provoked Brenda or that we were just trying to cash in on the situation. But the facts spoke for themselves. The criminal conviction, the witness testimony, the photographic evidence of Elena's injuries, these were not things that could be explained away or dismissed. As the months passed and turned into years, the trauma of that day faded but never disappeared entirely. Elena returned to work at the hospital and threw herself back into caring for her young patients. She said that helping kids through their own medical crises gave her a sense of purpose and reminded her of what was truly important. I continued my software development work and my advocacy for HOA reform. We made peace with what had happened, not in the sense of forgiving Brenda, because what she did was unforgivable, but in the sense of not letting it define our lives. We chose to focus on the positive outcomes, the friendships we had formed, the changes we had helped bring about in our community and beyond, the awareness we had raised about an important issue. Brenda served 3 years of her 5-year sentence before being released on parole. We received notification of her release as required by Arizona's victim notification system. She moved out of state to Oregon to live with a sister. As far as we know, she never returned to Arizona. The 10-year no-contact order remained in effect, and we had no desire to ever see or hear from her again. The Saguaro Heights HOA continued to thrive under new leadership. Property values in the neighborhood actually increased after Brenda's removal, contradicting her prediction that relaxed enforcement would lead to decline. Turns out that people were willing to pay a premium to live in a community where they were treated with respect and common sense rather than subjected to petty tyranny. On the 3rd anniversary of the attack, Elena and I hosted a barbecue in our backyard. We invited the neighbors who had supported us through the ordeal, including Detective Holloway and his family, Linda Morales and her husband, and several other residents who had become friends. It was a beautiful spring evening, not too hot yet, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of mesquite smoke from the grill. As I stood there, flipping burgers and listening to the sound of laughter and conversation around me, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude that Elena had survived, that Detective Holloway had been there at the right moment, that our community had ultimately done the right thing. The experience had been traumatic and terrible, but it had also revealed the best in people. The neighbors who brought us meals and offered support, the police officers and prosecutors who took the case seriously, the jury that held Brenda accountable, the residents who voted to change the leadership and culture of our HOA. Elena came up beside me and slipped her arm around my waist. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Just how lucky we are," I said. "Considering everything that happened," she nodded, resting her head on my shoulder. "We are lucky, but we also fought for justice and we got it. That matters." She was right. We had fought and we had won. Not just in the legal sense, though that was important, but in the larger battle to reclaim our home and our community from someone who had tried to rule through fear and intimidation. We had stood up to a bully, and when she crossed the line into criminal violence, we had made sure she faced the consequences. The scars remained, both physical and emotional. Elena still occasionally touched her throat when she was stressed, an unconscious gesture that reminded us both of how close we had come to losing everything. But we had survived, and we had grown stronger. Our marriage was stronger, tested by crisis and proven resilient. Our connection to our community was stronger, built on shared experience and mutual support. As the evening wore on, and the Arizona sky darkened to deep purple studded with stars, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. It had started with something so mundane, a parking space, a petty dispute over a covenant in a homeowner association's rulebook. It had escalated into a life-threatening attack and a criminal trial. But it had ended with justice served, lives rebuilt, and a community transformed. I thought about Brenda sometimes, wondering if she understood the magnitude of what she had done, if she had found any peace or redemption in prison. I did not hate her anymore. Hatred required too much energy, and I had better things to do with my life. But I hoped she had learned something, that she had come to understand that power, even the small power of an HOA presidency, came with responsibility, and that treating people with cruelty and disrespect always had consequences. The legal system had worked, slowly and imperfectly, but it had worked. Brenda had been arrested, prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned. She had lost her position, her reputation, and her freedom. The civil lawsuit had held her financially accountable. The protective order had kept Elena safe. These were not small victories. In a world where justice often seemed elusive, we had experienced it firsthand. The reforms we had pushed for in the HOA were modest but meaningful. The parking rules were now reasonable and flexible. The fine structure had been revised to be less punitive and more graduated. A homeowner bill of rights had been adopted, guaranteeing residents the ability to contest violations and requiring the board to act in good faith. It was not a revolution, but it was progress. On a larger scale, our story had contributed to a growing national conversation about HOA reform. Several states had passed new laws in the wake of high-profile cases like ours, providing more oversight and more protections for homeowners. It was a slow process and there was still much work to be done, but change was happening. As the party wound down and guests started heading home, Detective Holloway pulled me aside. "I have been thinking about that day a lot lately," he said. "About the split-second decisions we make and how they can change everything. If I had checked my mail 5 minutes earlier or later, if I had not heard the screaming, if I had hesitated or assumed someone else would handle it, the outcome could have been so different." "But you did not hesitate," I said. "You ran toward danger when most people would run away. That is who you are," he shrugged, looking a bit embarrassed. "I just did what anyone should do, but I am glad it worked out. Elena is an amazing person and the world is better with her in it." I felt tears prick at my eyes. "Thank you, Ryan, for everything," he clasped my shoulder. "You and Elena would have been fine without me. You are fighters, but I am honored to have been part of your story." After everyone left, Elena and I cleaned up together, working in comfortable silence. We had developed a rhythm over the years, anticipating each other's movements, passing dishes and loading the dishwasher in perfect coordination. These small moments of domestic harmony were precious to me now in a way they had not been before. The attack had reminded us both how fragile life was, how quickly everything could change. Later, as we lay in bed, Elena turned to me in the darkness. "Do you ever regret buying this house, joining this HOA?" I thought about it carefully before answering. "No," I said finally. "I regret that Brenda made our lives hell for a while. I regret that you got hurt. But I do not regret the house or the community. This is our home. We fought for it and we made it better. That means something." She was quiet for a long moment. "I used to have nightmares about that day. About her hands around my throat, about not being able to breathe. But lately, when I think about it, what I remember most is you running out of the house to help me, and Ryan appearing like some kind of superhero, and all the neighbors who came to our door with food and support. The bad stuff happened, but so did a lot of good stuff." "That is a healthy way to look at it," I said, pulling her close. "My therapist would be proud," she said with a little laugh. We had both continued therapy individually and as a couple. It had helped us process the trauma and communicate better with each other. There had been moments when I wanted to be strong for Elena and ended up bottling up my own feelings. There had been times when she felt guilty for the stress and expense the attack had caused our family. Working through those feelings with professional help had been crucial to our recovery. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a run through the neighborhood. The sun was just coming up, painting the desert landscape in soft pastels. I ran past houses where I now knew the residents by name, where I could wave and get a friendly wave back. I ran past Brenda's old house, which had been sold after her conviction to a young family with 2 kids. They had painted it a different color and planted new flowers in the front yard, erasing the last visible traces of her presence. I ran past the spot where the attack had happened, our driveway, which now held both of our cars parked side by side in the garage. We had finally gotten rid of the home gym equipment, donating it to a community center and reclaiming the garage space. It seemed like such a simple solution in retrospect, but we had been stubborn about it on principle. Sometimes stubbornness was necessary to stand up for what was right, but sometimes flexibility was the wiser path. Learning to tell the difference was an ongoing process. As I finished my run and walked back to the house, cooling down and stretching, I saw Linda Morales out watering her plants. She waved cheerfully. "Morning, Marcus. Beautiful day." "Morning, Linda. How are things?" "Good. The board is meeting next week to discuss the new landscaping proposals. Much less dramatic than the old days," I laughed. "Thank God for that." "Amen," she said. "You and Elena should come to the meeting if you want. We are trying to get more resident input on decisions." "We will be there," I promised. Inside, Elena was making coffee, still in her pajamas, her hair tousled from sleep. She looked up when I came in, smiling. "Good run." "Great run." "Linda invited us to the board meeting next week." "Sounds good. We should probably make an appearance. Show people that HOA meetings do not have to end in criminal charges." We both laughed at that, dark humor that came from having lived through something terrible and come out the other side. The years continued to pass. We celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary with a trip to Hawaii, something we had been planning to do before the attack derailed our finances. The settlement money from Brenda helped make it possible, a silver lining to a dark cloud. We renewed our vows on a beach in Maui, with the Pacific Ocean as our backdrop and the warm tropical sun on our faces. It felt like a new beginning. Elena got promoted to head nurse in the pediatric emergency department, a role she had worked toward for years. I switched jobs to a different tech company that offered better work-life balance and the ability to work remotely full-time. We talked about starting a family, a conversation that had been put on hold during the chaos, but now felt possible again. The Saguaro Heights HOA, under Linda's continued leadership, and then under subsequent presidents who followed her example, became known as one of the better-managed communities in the Phoenix area. The property values continued to climb. The neighborhood won awards for its community programs and resident satisfaction. It turned out that treating people with respect and managing a community with common sense was actually good for everyone involved. We stayed in touch with many of the people who had supported us through the ordeal. Detective Holloway and his wife became godparents to our daughter when she was born 2 years after the attack. We named her Grace, in part because of the grace we had been shown by so many people during our darkest time. At Grace's baptism, surrounded by family and friends in a small church in Scottsdale, I gave a short speech about what she meant to us and about the community that had helped us survive and thrive. I talked about the importance of standing up for what is right, of holding people accountable for their actions, and of showing compassion and support to those in need. I talked about how darkness and light existed in the world side by side, and how we all had a choice about which one we would contribute to. 3 years ago, I said, looking out at the gathered faces, my wife nearly died at the hands of someone who valued power and control more than human decency. But she survived because of the quick action of a hero, because of a legal system that worked, and because of a community that refused to accept cruelty as normal. Grace will grow up knowing that story. She will grow up knowing that bad things happen, but also that good people can make a difference. She will grow up in a neighborhood where her parents fought for justice and won, and she will grow up surrounded by people who have proven that they care about doing what is right. There was not a dry eye in the room. Elena squeezed my hand, tears running down her cheeks. Detective Holloway stood with his arm around Jennifer, looking proud. Linda Morales dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Even my stoic father looked emotional. After the ceremony, as we gathered for a celebration lunch, people shared their own stories of triumph over adversity, of standing up to bullies, of fighting for justice in their own lives. It reminded me that our story, while unique in its specific details, was part of a larger human story about resilience and courage and the refusal to accept injustice. Brenda's name came up occasionally over the years, usually in the context of new HOA members asking about the history of the community. The story had become almost legendary, whispered about in hushed tones, a cautionary tale about what happened when power went unchecked. Some of the details got exaggerated in the retelling, as stories often do. We tried to correct the record when we heard wildly inaccurate versions, but mostly we let people talk. The core truth remained unchanged. A person in authority had abused her power, committed a violent crime, and faced serious consequences. We occasionally heard updates about Brenda through various channels. She had apparently struggled to adjust after her release from prison. She had difficulty finding employment, which was common for convicted felons. Her marriage, which had been strained during the trial, ended in divorce. She lived a quiet, isolated life in Oregon, working part-time at a grocery store and making her required restitution payments. I felt a twinge of pity for her sometimes, for the way she had destroyed her own life through her actions. But mostly I felt nothing. She had made her choices and she was living with the consequences. The legal and advocacy work continued. I served on the board of a nonprofit organization dedicated to HOA reform and homeowner rights. We provided resources to people dealing with abusive HOAs, connected them with attorneys, and lobbied for stronger laws. It was not glamorous work, but it was important. Every few months, someone would reach out to tell us that our story had given them the courage to stand up to their own HOA or to fight back against unreasonable enforcement. Those messages made all the difficult moments worthwhile. Elena found her own way of channeling the experience into something positive. She started volunteering with domestic violence organizations, helping survivors of assault navigate the medical and legal systems. Her personal experience with strangulation and trauma made her uniquely qualified to understand what these survivors were going through. She became a powerful advocate, testifying before legislative committees about the need for better training for medical professionals in recognizing and documenting assault, particularly strangulation, which often left minimal visible evidence despite being potentially lethal. Our lives settled into a new normal that was richer and more purposeful than the old normal had been. We appreciated things more, took less for granted, and maintained deeper connections with the people who mattered. The attack had been a horrible experience, but it had also clarified our priorities and shown us what we were capable of when pushed to our limits. I still thought about that Tuesday afternoon sometimes, the way the day had started so ordinarily and ended so catastrophically. I thought about the split seconds that had made all the difference, Detective Holloway being in the right place at the right time, his training and instincts kicking in, his courage in intervening immediately. I thought about how easily the story could have ended differently, with Elena dead or brain damaged, with Brenda free to continue terrorizing the neighborhood with justice never being served. But that was not how it ended. The system worked. The bad guy got punished. The victims got justice and healing. The community learned and changed for the better. It was not a perfect ending, there was no such thing, but it was a good ending. It was an ending we could live with, one that allowed us to move forward with our lives without bitterness or fear consuming us. As I wrote these final words, sitting in my home office in the house that had been at the center of so much drama and pain and eventual triumph, I could hear Elena reading to Grace in the next room. Their voices, Elena's gentle storytelling and Grace's excited questions, were the soundtrack of my new life. This was what mattered. This was what we had fought for. The HOA parking dispute that had started everything seemed almost absurdly trivial now. It was hard to believe that anyone could care so much about where a car was parked that they would risk everything to enforce that preference. But people did care about strange things, and when they were given power without accountability, those obsessions could turn dangerous. Our story was not unique, but it was instructive. It showed what could happen when HOAs operated without proper oversight, when board members prioritized rules over people, when enforcement became an end unto itself rather than a means to maintain community standards. It also showed what could happen when good people refused to accept abuse, when they fought back through legal channels, when they demanded accountability and change. The reforms we helped bring about in Saguaro Heights had rippled outward. Other HOAs in Arizona and beyond had adopted similar changes. State legislatures had passed new laws. Awareness had been raised. It was not enough, there was still so much work to be done, but it was progress. Real, measurable, meaningful progress. And at the end of the day, Elena was alive and healthy. Our family was thriving. Our home was truly ours, a place of safety and happiness rather than stress and conflict. We had our community, both the neighborhood we lived in and the broader community of advocates and survivors we had connected with. We had purpose and meaning and hope. The parking space that had triggered everything sat empty in our driveway now, a monument to absurdity and also to survival. We could park there anytime we wanted. No fines, no harassment, no fear. It was a small freedom, but freedom nonetheless. And it had cost far more than it should have, but in the end, it was worth every fight, every tear, every moment of fear and pain, because it represented something larger than parking. It represented the principle that people deserved to be treated with dignity and respect in their own homes, that power had limits, and that justice, though slow, was possible. That was the story. That was our story. And though I wished it had never been necessary to live through it, I was grateful for how it ended and for who we became because of it.